She'd watched him walking over the horizon for almost 6 hours now. She loved getting guests, loved seeing the resignation of men half dead with thirst, trading certain death in the sands for possible death near her waters. And they were hers. The promise of Ramsay still stood, even if it had been a millennium since the Concord. By right of blood and writ of paper, she was the queen of the deeper Duat, and it was a queen's privilege to choose her guests, and, occasionally, kill them with her claws. She could have flown over, but she had time. More time than anyone. More than enough time to wait. Her guest was not half dead. He was, to be technical, less than a quarter dead, but that was only if you measured things in years. He was young. His face certainly seemed less lined than her own. There wasn't much else she could judge age from. The lines of her form folded into wings and furs and claws, at the same point that his folded into silks and beads. He'd prepared for the meeting by bringing a wealth of spices. It was a trick common to royal travellers. If sweat couldn't be prevented, it could at least be masked. She could still pick traces of it up under the sandalwood and myrrh, but it was pleasant. Salty and metallic and sharp, underneath all the soft wisps of smoke. He'd brought her gifts. When she told him that the gifts were not acceptable as passage, he said that wasn't how gifts worked. Gifts weren't given in exchanges, they were given for the joy of giving, and it brought him joy to share with her. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply asked if he intended to cross through her Duat. "Maybe," he replied. "What's your price?" "A riddle," she said. "If you get it right, you can pass, but if you get it wrong, I will devour even your bones." He grinned, and it wasn't false bravado. He'd known the cost before she said it. "I love riddles. I accept." She loved this part. She loved the tension of it, that singular moment of truth where she wasn't just a mind or a monster, but something straddling both worlds. She spoke. "I can survive beyond death, but can be broken without force. I can summon without breath, but a promise." She looked at him wide-eyed. It wasn't her best riddle, but it was one she'd made herself. It wasn't supposed to be this easy. She let him pass, but she did, to her great shame, sulk. To his credit, he only lingered an hour or so in the shade of the oasis. There was a longing to him that she couldn't describe. It unsettled her, but it went away when he took his camels and continued past, travelling on into the deep Duat. She forgot about his gifts until long after he passed the horizon. She had expected human trinkets, gold and gems, useless baubles. The pelts that had been carefully rolled up and placed inside the chest were strangely thoughtful. She carried them back to her cave and laid them flat across the floor. That night she slept better than she had in many, many years. In the morning she woke up and smelled myrrh, and was almost happy to imagine the prince coming back. If she was disappointed to realize that the smell was coming from the scent soaked into the furs, that was a secret she could keep even from herself. It was a week before he came back. She recognized his outline on the horizon. She had a good memory, and beyond that, he'd made quite an impression on his first meeting with her. He'd begun to run low on his spices, and his clothes were looking far more rumpled than they had at the start. That travel was beginning to wear him down, should have meant nothing to her. Now she felt odd. Would she still feel victorious if he failed her riddle? Or would it haunt her, knowing she could only catch him at his worst? Did she want to catch him? She waited for him to make it to her oasis again. It seemed to be part of the ritual, to sit and watch the speck on the horizon grow to the size of a man. They didn't exchange pleasantries when he arrived. Instead, he gave a small nod to acknowledge her before climbing down from atop his camel. She hadn't demanded it prior, because she knew all too well how easy it was to catch a camel, but there was still something respectful in the gesture. Here was a prince willing to die with dignity. Here was a man who lived and died by rules. Could she be blamed for admiring that? Only when he was fully settled in to listen did she begin her riddle. Toothless maw that eats all these, raw flesh, dung, fresh air, and trees. At night I'm bright, in day I'm black. I die, I'm gone, but always back. She was on the third line when she saw his face light up. He waited to answer this time, more focused on being polite than showing off how clever he was. She liked that. She knew he was clever, but now she knew he could be patient too. A campfire. It was one of her favourite riddles, and the joy she got was twofold. She was happy for the prince, happy that he would survive another day, and happy for herself too. It was indefinitely preferable to lose with skill than to win through circumstance. She would feel robbed if she had to eat the prince on a bad day. If he lost, he needed to lose at his best. He needed to lose in a way that mattered. He went through the oasis again, but lingered far longer. They spoke in moments about each other's lives, her memories of the time before even Ramses, and his experience as the seventh in line to the throne. He was trusted to act as an emissary, specifically because he was so far from inheriting the throne. Not that I'd want it anyway, he said. A camel is a better throne than any silly golden chair. The seat in the palace only lets me see the bald spot on the high priest's head. The saddle on this camel lets me see all the beauty in the world. His head wasn't turned towards her when he said that, but she could see his eyes glance over her. It was easy to pretend she didn't notice, and he did nothing to press it further. She showed him the best trees for picking dates, the best ponds for catching fish, and the first cave she set her lair up in, back before even Ramses, back when she was much, much smaller. She slept in the next morning. The sunlight made a soft beam through the cave, over the pelts, before landing across her face. Any other day it would have been a wonderful way to wake up, but the realization that she missed her chance to say goodbye made her scramble. She made a short flight over the waters to see if he was gone, and got her answer before even landing. There was no camel tied to the palms. Still, he'd left her a gift. The boar roasting over glowing coals had clearly been caught the night before, and the fact that it was unspiced meant it was for her. It was also another oddly thoughtful gesture. How many humans would realize that unseasoned meat was a sphinx's preference? How many would research that far? She landed near the meal and approached. Down on the ground, there was so much more detail to see. The tracks of the camel, the care taken to not leave a mess, the simple note left beside the fire pit. She reached out and read, "I'm sure you don't depend on travellers for your meals, but I do feel bad having deprived you twice. Enjoy the boar. I will be back in 2 weeks." She hadn't taken a bite yet, but she could pretend the warmth in her stomach was the meal. 2 bites was all it took to make the illusion complete. She waited until the 15th day before flying. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. A sandstorm, perhaps, or a heat-struck camel. Instead, it was only a few minutes' flight before the smell of blood caught in the back of her throat. It was hard to describe what happened after that. Sometimes she was more mind than monster. Sometimes she was more monster than mind. That day was a monster day. He lost a lot of blood by the time she found him, a frankly terrifying amount of blood. She could carry him back to the oasis, but that had only delayed the inevitable. But Sphinx knew many things that humans did not. She carried him, and he was light in her claws. Light in the way that humans were, but some small, scared part of her brain was worried that the blood loss made him lighter still, like a date left in the sun. She followed the trail through the desert until she found the thieves that did this. They had his gifts and his spices. They'd have taken the clothes off his corpse if they'd been able to catch his camel. They'd have taken his life, the one human life she'd valued in 1,000 years, and they'd have taken his life. It was hard to hate humans. They were so small and short-lived that taking them personally felt childish. But this day she hated, and it made killing easy. 5 of the 6 bandits were extraneous. The last, thankfully, had blood that smelled like the prince. He was much less thankful about this than she was. She took them both back, the prince held gently in her front talons, the bandit half crushed in the back. The transfer spell took exactly as much as it needed. It would have been crueler to let the bandit suffer the same fate he'd intended to inflict on the prince, to struggle on with too little blood, and to his body failed. It was tempting, but she felt a sick gratitude that he had what she needed when she needed it, so she made the end quick, or quick enough. 30 seconds isn't long, but it's an eternity when falling. The prince recovered enough to speak after 3 days. He asked her to tell him riddles, and if she was as jealous of her domain as she pretended. She'd have said no. But good riddles were the tool she used to rid herself of unwanted guests, and this guest was wanted. So she read riddles to him for days at a time. Read all the ones she'd hoarded from scholars. Read ones she wrote herself just for fun. She started with her best riddles because she loved his praise, but moved on to her earlier ones because what they lacked in cleverness, they made up for by being earnest. He loved those riddles the most. 1 week stretched into 2. He spent his days swimming after fish, chasing after boars with spears made of stone. She hadn't seen that in a very long time. And scurrying up the trees to pick dates. And his nights he spent imagining riddles around a campfire. She knew it wasn't going to be permanent, but that didn't mean it couldn't be beautiful. She'd outlived so many things in this world, seen rivers change courses and lakes run dry. If impermanence was a poison, then it was a poison she couldn't avoid. There was no wall she could build to keep death at bay. She could only share her home with it and hope that one wonderful faraway day that even death would die. But that day would not be soon. The king's men found the oasis after a month of searching. There were no riddles this time. The prince left willingly, and the men with bronze blades stayed respectfully far from her part of the Duat. It went as good as it could have gone, all things considered. If some part of her felt empty afterwards, well, maybe she just needed to eat. Regular gifts did find her way to the Duat, as thanks after that. Herds of goats were released near her borders to hunt at her own leisure. Soft pelts from the northern lands were delivered in chests, and she luxuriated in their fluff. Most importantly, a regular shipment of black vellum began to make its way to the Duat. She was told explicitly that it was for her to write more riddles, and also, if she had a spare moment, she could send letters back with the vendor. The prince always made sure to send at least one out to her, and she always made sure to send one back. Always. It had been decades. She couldn't see how humans were like this. She'd written with him 6 months ago. He'd been sharp as ever, sharper even. Time had winnowed him into a razor's edge, and she'd been so amazed to see him change. And then he'd gotten busy, and they stopped writing letters for just a month, and then it was 2 months, and then 3, and now he wasn't well. The last letter she'd received hadn't even been from him. It had been from his eldest brother, the reigning pharaoh, and it had broken her heart. He was forgetting everything. His mind was breaking. Decades of brilliance, and now he was falling apart at the seams. Some days, He didn't even know who he was. But on the days that he did, the only thing he could talk about was going to the oasis one last time. And his brother, who had kept him close, who had been so protective of him after his near death with the bandits, had finally agreed. He was going to be arriving any day now. The note had a sort of helpless plea attached, that he didn't know what to do at this point, but that whatever it cost her to keep him comfortable, he would repay tenfold. She sent a letter back saying it was a gift. She was the queen of the Duat, and it pleased her to give this to her neighbouring kingdom. Never mind that her kingdom had no subjects. Never mind that she had no armies at her disposal. What she had, she could give, and this was easy. It made her happy to write the letter. It reminded her of the first words the prince had spoken to her, all those years ago. He arrived a few days later, escorted by 50 soldiers. She was grateful that he was in one of his lucid moments. She couldn't imagine how it would be to be seen and not known. She didn't wait for them to make it all the way to her oasis. She flew over to meet them and then carried him back. The traditional wait was from when she thought she had time, before she'd realized that there were ways for even an immortal to find themselves in a hurry. He spent his first day back chasing fish, the same way he did before. The boars he left be, 70, he insisted, was far too old to be messing with boars. And when the evening came, they gathered by a campfire to share riddles. They went back and forth, laughing at each other's crafts. It was only after an hour of reminiscing that she actually asked him her favourite riddle. The riddle that she had permanently written in as his riddle. The one with toothless moors and meat and light in the dark. And he stared at her, not blankly, but worse, confused, because he recognized the riddle, but could no longer answer it. She could see the distress growing in him, and it broke her heart. He hemmed and hawed, but right when he looked on the brink of giving up, he looked at the fire and started in relief. "A campfire," he said, and they laughed. And if he could pretend his tears were mirth, and not mourning, she could pretend that hers were the same. He was not well the next day. He knew who he was, thankfully, but didn't remember getting there. He stumbled around, almost dazed, until he saw her. Then he sighed in relief. "This is my favourite dream," he confided in her. "I'd like to get back here for real one day, but this dream is lovely. Can you read me some more riddles?" Just like last time. I've never forgotten. She didn't even touch her later works. She went to her earliest ones, the easy ones, and the way he pondered minutes at a time made her stomach clench. She did not sleep that night. She had spent literally her entire life trying to make harder and harder riddles, and now they needed to be easy. They needed to be simple. They needed to rhyme and feel like riddles. But they needed to be solvable by someone that... She had to stop writing for a few moments to compose herself. She couldn't afford to cry on the vellum. A new shipment wouldn't arrive in time. She was immortal, but she was still running out of time. He woke up the next morning completely confused. She prepared her first riddle as, "Who sits in the sand beneath my lair? Who swims through fish with thin white hair? Who braved the desert and survived, then returned home alive and thrived?" But after several seconds of silence, she couldn't take it anymore. "It's you," she said. "Oh," he replied, surprised. "What do you know about this place?" she asked. After several more long seconds of quiet. "Not a lot," he admitted. "But I know I love you." "I love you too," she said. That was the only riddle she had for the day. He fell asleep in the mid-morning, and she took the time to go catch a goat for them. He was still asleep when she returned, and remained that way for the rest of the day. She stayed awake long after sunset, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and praying it would never stop. She wasn't sure when she fell asleep. She just knew that when she woke up, her prayer had gone unanswered. The vellum vendor arrived at the start of the deep Duat, only to find the oasis empty. He looked for hours, but there was only a single vellum left behind in the cave. He grabbed it and read the half-finished riddle. What hangers and is never full? What is complete but never whole? What pierces armor, shields, and hearts? What ends before it even starts? What force can make a monster frowl? What talon and what dreadful claw can heal the slice it makes each day? What pain can make the godless pray? It was all he could take back to the pharaoh. He hoped it was enough.